Hello, I'm Alexander. I have a new original story for you. Enjoy watching.
By the time Mara was led onto the execution dock, the whole harbor had come to watch her drown on land. They had tied her wrists with hemp so rough it cut her skin every time she trembled. They had looped a second rope around her throat and fastened it to the black post at the center of the dock, as if the sea itself needed help deciding what to do with her. Around her, the villagers stood shoulder to shoulder on the stone steps and along the pier, their faces bright with salt wind and the kind of hunger that loved a public ending. A banished pearl diver was entertainment. A ruined pearl diver was proof. Elder Halvin lifted his staff and let the crowd settle into silence. The white gull feathers bound to its top shivered in the wind, and the brass shell at its base caught the noon light like a small, polished eye. Mara of Tallow Point, he called, using her full name the way a judge might use a knife. You stand here, accused of theft from the tide, disobedience to the altar, and trespass against the laws that keep our harbor fed. By sunset, you will be stripped of your rights, cast from the village, and forbidden from any future descent into sacred water. A murmur passed through the crowd. Not pity, relief. Mara kept her chin up, even though the rope bit deeper when she swallowed. Her wet hair clung to her neck in dark ropes. The last dive still clung to her, the cold in her bones, the ache behind her eyes. She had spent her whole life reading water by color, by pull, by the way the currents shifted against a stone. She knew when a shoal moved. She knew when a storm changed its mind. She knew the sea better than the men condemning her ever had. And still, they called her unclean. At the front of the crowd, two of the older women pressed their hands to their mouths, not in grief, but to hide smiles. Mara recognized them. She had once carried their sons home when the fishing boats overturned. She had once brought back pearls from depths no one else dared touch. She had once given away her share of shell powder so the children would not cough through winter. None of that mattered now, because last week, when the pearl vault came up short, the elders had found the easiest body to blame. Her. Not the men who weighed the harvest. Not the clerk who kept the ledgers. Not the priest who blessed the baskets and took his cut before dawn. The girl with raw hands and a father who had died under the current line. The girl who knew how to hold her breath longer than anyone else, and who had been foolish enough to think that skill could make her loved. Elder Halvin raised one hand. Let the village witness the consequence of greed. Greed. The word struck harder than the rope. Mara laughed once, a broken little sound no one seemed to hear. They had dragged her from her hut at dawn. They had taken her dive knife, her wicker basket, the small charm her mother had carved from driftwood and shaped into a wave. They had not let her speak at the hearing. They had not let her name the missing crates. They had not let her explain that the pearl ledgers did not match the harbor counts because someone had been skimming from the holding jars for months. When she tried, Elder Halvin had smiled as if indulging a child. Now he turned to the crowd and lowered his voice. Before the sentence is completed, there is one final right. The accused must be shown the truth beneath our feet. Two dock guards dragged a plank away from the execution platform's edge. Mara's breath stopped. Beneath the dock, the tide moved in a dark, narrow channel between the pilings. Salt foam licked the beams below, and the smell rising from that opening was not ordinary harbor rot. It was colder, older. It carried a metallic sweetness that prickled the back of her tongue. Something was there. Something had been there the entire time. A chain clinked softly from the water below. Mara's pulse kicked hard enough to hurt. She leaned as far as the rope allowed and saw it. A faint green glow pulsing beneath the dock, threading through the murk like trapped moonlight. The chain was wrapped around a shape she could not fully make out. Something too broad to be a fish and too still to be a beast. One enormous hand, pale as carved bone, shifted once against the shadows. Then the eyes opened. Gold. Not the dull yellow of a herring belly or the glassy sheen of a dead thing, but molten gold, fixed on her through the dark water, with a focus so fierce it made the air feel thin. The crowd did not see them, or if they did, they pretended not to. Only Mara saw the chained figure below the dock, and only Mara heard the low voice that brushed through the pilings like a current finding a crack. "Do you mean to leave me here?" Her blood went cold. The Sea King was real. Every child in Tallow Point had grown up with the story. The sea's hidden ruler, ancient and terrible, who slept beneath the harbor until the village's sacred bells woke him to bless the pearl harvest. The elders told the tale as proof that obedience kept them safe. Mara had always thought it was a warning wrapped in ceremony. Now he was below her, chained. And no one on the dock above seemed to know, or maybe no one had ever cared enough to look. Elder Halvin struck his staff on the planks. "The accused has been granted a final mercy. She may confess before the sea witnesses her shame." Mara did not look at him. She could not. Her attention had caught on the chain. It was not ordinary iron. Even from above, she could see the glow pulsing along its links, a pale green seam of runes or salt fire, or something older than both. Each time the tide shifted, the chain tightened, and the movement below the dock went still with visible pain. A captive, not a guardian, not a blessing. A prisoner. Something hard and hot moved in Mara's chest. Anger, yes, but also recognition so sharp it nearly made her dizzy. Because she knew what it was to be displayed as proof. She knew what it was to be named a threat, simply because someone powerful needed a frightened crowd. The Sea King's gaze did not leave her face. He did not plead. He did not command. He only waited, as if the question belonged to her and no one else. "Do you mean to leave me here?" Above them, the bells began to ring. 3 slow tones, the signal for sentence. The crowd inhaled as one. Mara felt the rope tighten around her throat as the guard beside her braced to kick the support stool from under her feet. One shove, and she would hang above the water, gasping until the harbor blurred into darkness. The elders had made a spectacle of mercy by giving her an audience first. Then came the smell. Not the stink of tar or fish or sweat, but a sudden deep rush of brine so pure it cleared her head. The water below the dock was rising. No one else seemed to notice. Mara's heart hammered. The sea was not obeying the tide chart. The tide was too early by hours. It was climbing the pilings, sliding up the stone supports, gathering beneath the execution dock with a pressure that made the wood groan. The Sea King watched her, still silent. For one impossible second, she understood with crystal clarity that the ocean was waiting for a choice. Not the elders. Not the crowd. Her. Mara twisted against the rope until the fibers scraped her wrists raw. "If I cut you free," she whispered, and no one above heard her, "what happens to me?" The golden eyes blinked once. Then, from the dark below the dock, "I do not know." That should have frightened her more. Instead, it made the air around her feel strangely honest. The guards were moving now, one lifting a pole to pull her upright over the edge. The crowd began to chant for the sentence to be done. Elder Halvin smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. Mara's gaze dropped to the chain. The nearest link was no wider than her thumb. The glow ran through it in a pattern she almost recognized, a locking sequence built from knotwork and pressure points. She had seen similar work before on pearl cages and haul nets, the kind that resisted both force and patience. Her hands were tied, but not useless. Not if the knife had been hidden well enough. She shifted her left wrist against the rope burn, felt the seam at the base of her cuff, where the dock guards had overlooked the smallest of her tools. A thin shard of shell, honed to a razor edge from years of scraping barnacles from hulls, slid against the inside of her palm. Not a weapon, a diver's habit, a thing no one had thought important enough to remove. The guard behind her barked, "Now!" Mara closed her fingers around the shell shard and made her decision. She dropped. The crowd screamed as the stool vanished from beneath her feet. The rope jerked tight, and for half a heartbeat, the world went white with pain. Then the water below the dock met her body like a fist, opening into cold hands. She struck the surface hard, plunged into darkness, and the scream above her turned distant and warped as the harbor swallowed the sound. The execution dock vanished overhead. Down here, the water was green-black and alive. Mara fought the rope for one breath, then another, twisting until the shard came free in her fist. The current tugged at her hair. Pilings rose like forest trunks around her. Above, light fractured into trembling pieces. And there, only a yard away, was the Sea King. He was larger than any man had a right to be, even kneeling in the narrow channel beneath the dock. His skin shone pale beneath the water, etched with old scars that looked less like wounds and more like marks made by storms. The chain crossed his chest, through both wrists, and into a ring fixed to the stone base of the harbor wall. His eyes locked onto the shell shard in her hand. He knew what she meant to do. Mara pressed the shard to the nearest glowing link. The metal burned cold against her skin. For one suspended instant, nothing happened. Then the runes along the chain flared so bright, the water turned white-green around them, and the entire dock above her gave a horrible, living shudder. Mara's body lurched, as if the sea itself had taken her by the spine. The Sea King's breath moved through the water like thunder. The chain split. The sound was not like metal breaking. It was like a door opening in a place that had been sealed for centuries. Above her, the execution dock groaned again, this time in terror. Men shouted. Someone ran. The crowd broke apart in chaos as the pilings buckled under a sudden surge of water. Mara turned just in time to see the dock tilt, its support sinking into the harbor, as though the sea had decided it no longer recognized their claim. The villagers shrieked and stumbled backward onto the pier. Elder Halvin's staff snapped in half when he tried to brace himself, and Mara, still half underwater, half falling, found herself not dragged down but lifted. The water rose around her, not to drown, to hold. The current gathered beneath her ribs and under her knees, straightening her body until she was floating upright in the sinking chamber like a queen in a flooded throne room. Salt water streamed from her hair. Her wrists, still bound, no longer pulled her down. The tide cupped her feet as if it knew her shape. Every face on the dock had gone pale. Mara stared back at them in stunned silence, not understanding whether she was alive, condemned, or something worse. Then the Sea King reached for the broken chain hanging from his chest, looked past her to the shattered dock above, and said in a voice so low the water itself seemed to listen, "At last, the sea has chosen who may stand." Elder Halvin found his voice first. "Monster!" he roared, pointing down at Mara with a shaking hand. "Thief of royal power! She has stolen the tide's obedience." But the tide did not move for him. It moved for her. And as the first wave climbed the pier steps, carrying something dark and glinting in its foam, Mara realized the ocean had not only saved her, it had begun to expose the village. Because there, rolling across the boards at the feet of the screaming elders, was a small iron seal stamped with the harbor mark of Tallow Point. A seal Mara had seen only in the counting room. A seal the elders used to mark official pearl shipments. A seal that should have been locked in the chest beneath the temple. And on its face, smeared with salt, was a single word she had never seen before. Stolen. For a moment, no one on the pier moved. The tide kept Mara upright in the flooded cavity beneath the dock, and the sea foam licked at the splintered beams like it was tasting the fear above. The iron seal rolled once more across the boards and came to rest at Elder Halvin's feet. He stared at it as if the ocean had placed a finger against his mouth and told him to hush. Then he kicked it away. "Do not look at that," he barked too quickly. "It is a trick." But the village had already looked. Mara saw it in their faces, the same faces that had watched her dragged from the low huts to the execution dock an hour ago. Faces that had wanted the shame to be clean and simple. They had come for a banishment. They had expected her to cry, plead, and vanish with her head down. Instead, the dock was half submerged. A sea king stood free beneath the broken planks, and a tide that should have killed her was holding her like she mattered. That was what frightened them. Not the monster. The possibility that they had been wrong. Elder Halvin recovered first. He straightened his soaked robe with trembling fingers and raised his staff again, though it no longer looked like an authority. It looked like a branch a man had grabbed in a storm and was hoping would become a weapon if he believed in it hard enough. "By the law of Tallow Point," he shouted, "Mara of the lower tide is still under sentence. She has interfered with sacred chains. She has reached into a royal binding. She has stolen what the sea did not give her." At the word stolen, the villagers glanced down at the seal again. Mara did not miss it. Neither did the Sea King. He was standing in the flooded space beneath the dock, without touching the beams above him, his bare shoulders pale in the green light, leaking through the water. The broken chain still hung from one wrist, and the glowing cut in it pulsed like a wound that had not decided whether to close. He had not rushed to the surface. He had not struck anyone. He had only lifted his chin and watched the men on the pier with a stillness that was somehow worse than rage. When Elder Halvin pointed down at him, the Sea King's gaze shifted, not to the elder, but to Mara. Not threatening, assessing. as if he were asking a question he refused to answer aloud. Mara swallowed. The tide around her ankles had a strange warmth now, a pressure like many hands supporting her weight. She could feel that if she bent her knees, the water would bear her. If she fought it, it would not. That knowledge scared her more than the dock sinking. Because the sea had never held anyone like this. Not in her memory. The villagers were shouting now. Some wanted the Sea King killed before he reached the boats. Others wanted Mara dragged back up the steps and tied harder, as if a tighter rope could make the ocean less interested in her. 2 men were already trying to lower a grappling line toward the chamber, only for a wave to slap the rope aside with the sharpness of a hand. "Leave her where she is," said a woman near the back, voice shaken. "The water is not letting her drown." That made the screaming stop for one brittle second, because it was true. A child near the pier edge pointed through tears at the flooded chamber. "She's standing in it," he whispered. "No," said one of the elders, but his voice lacked conviction. "She is floating." Mara almost laughed then, and the sound surprised her. She had never been the sort of person anyone looked at and called chosen. She had been the diver who came back with cracked fingernails, the girl with salt scars on her knees, the one the market wives hired when the shallows were bad, and the men were too proud to admit the deeper beds needed a careful eye. She had learned the sea the way other people learned handwriting, by spending enough time with it to know when it was lying. And the sea had lied to no one, more than the village elders. That thought arrived with the force of a memory. Not a new memory, an old one sharpened by danger. 3 nights before the banishment, Mara had been in the eastern cove before dawn, breaking open barnacle clusters and brushing silt from trapped shells, when she heard a soft knocking beneath the rocks. She had pried apart the weed-tangled gap and found a juvenile ray wedged in a fallen net, its wing torn, its body shaking so hard the water around it trembled. It should have fled when she touched it. Instead, it pressed against her palm, exhausted enough to trust the hand that freed it. She had cut the net away with her shell knife and carried it to deeper water herself, one slow stroke at a time, while the tide rose around her calves. She had never told anyone, not because it was shameful, because the village laughed at mercy when it did not pay. Now, in the flooded dock, the memory returned with an ugly clarity. The ray had not been ordinary. The elders' children caught strange fish in those waters after storm seasons, fish with silver stripes and a pulse that made the nets hum. Mara had always returned them. She had always assumed that was simply the right thing to do. But as she stared at the Sea King, she suddenly understood the direction of the silence between them. He knew something about the cove, about the net, about her. "Don't look at me like that," Mara muttered under her breath, not sure whether she meant the Sea King or the tide. His mouth curved, not into a smile, but into the smallest sign that he had heard her. Elder Halvin noticed it too, and it made him furious. "Take her eyes off him," he shouted. "She has bewitched the current." "She has done this with old diver tricks and filth-tongued sea charms." "Then why did your seal wash up?" someone shouted from the crowd. The words came from Thomas, one of the net menders, who had always been too quiet to be dangerous. He was staring at the iron seal, as if he had only just realized what it meant. "That stamp belongs in the temple chest," he said. "I carried the chest myself when the tax boats came." Elder Halvin's face went hard. Mara saw it. So did the Sea King. And there it was again, that tiny shift in the air that told her the ocean was no longer showing her random objects. It was choosing what to reveal and when. The sea had not brought up the seal to accuse anyone in general. It had brought up evidence. The harbor mark was followed by the rest of the tide. A sheet of weed tangled over a broken plank. A salt-dark ledger page. Then a second iron tag stamped with the same official mark. This one bent at the edge as if it had been pried from a chest. The villagers turned and saw them all together. Someone gasped. Someone else made the sign against bad weather. Mara leaned forward as far as the water would allow and peered through the broken beams. The ledger page was half covered in grime, but one line was visible enough to sting her eyes. Pearl quota increased by decree. She knew those words. She had heard them all her life, repeated by men who had never dived past their own fear. The quotas explained why divers came home bleeding and empty. They explained the penalties for bringing up weak pearls, pearls the elders claimed were undersized. They explained the constant shortages in the market, while the temple never seemed to run dry. And now the ocean had spit up the numbers. The villagers were reading them with her. Not all of them could make out the ink, but they could see enough to know that the seal, the ledger, and the bent tag had not drifted there by chance. Elder Halvin's voice sharpened to a knife. "Enough! This is theft from the temple." "No," said Mara before she could stop herself. Her voice echoed weirdly against the flooded wood. "It's the temple's mark." Every head turned. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She was still supposed to be the one who lowered her eyes when elders spoke. She was still supposed to nod and accept whatever sentence they attached to her name. But the tide held her steady, and the steadiness felt like permission. "Say it louder," the Sea King said quietly. Mara looked at him. For the first time, she noticed that he was not using his body to intimidate her. He had not stepped closer. He had not claimed her. He was waiting where the water made him half shadow, half crown, as if he understood the line between help and ownership better than anyone on that pier. The request was simple. So why did it feel like stepping onto a cliff? "Those marks are the temple's," she said, more clearly this time, forcing the words out past the fear. "Not mine, not the sea's. The temple chest stamp is the same one on the shipping seal. I've seen it in the counting room." A wave slapped the piling so hard the dock rocked again. That was the wrong thing to say. Mara knew it the moment the elders heard it. The counting room was where women like her were never meant to linger. It was where records were kept by men who pretended numbers were more sacred than hands. It was where she had been sent twice each month to tally the common pearl baskets because she had the patience to count despite the sting of salt. She had been visible there only as a worker, never as a witness. Now she had become a witness anyway. Elder Halvin advanced until he stood directly over the flooded opening. "You were not in the counting room to understand anything," he hissed. "You were there to carry shells and keep quiet." Mara's nails dug into her palms. "I was there because your clerks could not tell a cracked ledger from a clean one." The crowd made a sound like a held breath breaking. Halvin's mouth tightened. Lies. But the tide surged again, and this time it brought up another object, slower and darker than the first. It rolled in the foam at the base of the pier stairs and caught the light with a wet gleam. A pearl knife, not a diver's knife. Too narrow for that. Too ceremonial. The kind used in the temple when the elders inspected tribute. Mara knew it at once, because she had polished one exactly like it on festival mornings when no one else was available. She remembered the carved handle, the tiny chip near the guard, the habit Elder Halvin had of laying it beside the bowl while he praised the sea's generosity. The knife had a smear of black tar along its hilt. Tar from the deep mooring stones. Tar from the place beneath the temple where no one was supposed to go. The Sea King's eyes flicked to it, then back to her. It took her a second to understand why. He had not brought it up. He was letting her see it. The idea made her stomach twist, because it meant he trusted her judgment more than her fear. "Who touched the mooring stones?" she asked before she could stop herself. No one answered. That silence was answer enough. The elders shifted. The crowd parted as if a cold current had cut through them. Mara recognized the look on Halvin's face then. The same look he wore when the fish market price changed unexpectedly, and he had to lie faster than the truth could spread. He was not just angry. He was cornered. The Sea King lifted his bound wrist, and the broken end of the chain flashed green in the water. "Ask the next question," he said to Mara. It wasn't a command. That was what made it feel so dangerous. She stared at him, and for one impossible breath, everything else thinned away. The shouting villagers, the broken dock, the slick smell of river mud and salt. It was just the two of them, and the awful fact that he had been in chains under their feet, while she had been told her whole life that the sea made no bargains with people like her. "Why me?" she whispered. The words barely reached the surface. The Sea King did not answer. Instead, he turned his head toward the eastern channel, where the harbor water narrowed into a throat of rocks and submerged pilings. The tide there changed color, turning darker, as if something beneath it had stirred. Then the sea answered for him. A low horn sounded from beyond the harbor wall, not the village bell, a ship horn. 3 long notes, foreign and heavy, cut through the chaos. Every head snapped toward the outer moorings just as a rowboat burst around the jetty, oars churning wildly. 2 harbor guards were in it, both soaked, one nearly throwing himself overboard in panic. "The tax vessel is back," he yelled. "And it's not alone. They found something under the south reef." The words hit the pier like a thrown stone. The south reef was where the elder boats went when they wanted privacy. The south reef was where half the village knew not to fish. The south reef was where Mara had once seen lanterns at midnight and been told to forget it. Elder Halvin froze. For one single second, Mara saw fear on the old man's face that had nothing to do with the Sea King. The sea had chosen this moment on purpose. The realization struck her so hard, she nearly lost her footing. This was not random rescue, not even vengeance. The ocean was moving like a mind, and it was leading them somewhere. "Bring the rowboat here," Halvin ordered, too fast. "No one leaves this pier. Seal the gates." But the harbor master, an old woman with salt-white braids, was already looking between the tax guards and the sea and understanding too much. "You told us the South Reef was a dead shelf," she said. "It is," Halvin snapped. "Then why are they screaming?" she asked. No one answered that either. Mara felt the tide shift beneath her feet, urging her attention toward the channel. The water there seemed to be pulling in a line, slow and deliberate, like something hidden was being uncovered one breath at a time. She could not see what lay below it, only that the current was different. Warmer, heavier, almost resentful. The Sea King stepped one pace closer, and the water around his waist moved with him like obedient cloth. "Mara," he said, and hearing her name in his voice made the skin at her neck tighten. It was the first time anyone on that pier had said her name without spitting it. She looked at him. "Can you read the tide line?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that she almost laughed again, but there was no humor in it. There was purpose. There was need. There was something under the harbor wall that he wanted her to find, and he was asking because he believed she could. Not because she was favored, because she was skilled. Because she had always been skilled. Mara swallowed hard. Her whole life had been spent being told that skill in a girl like her was useful only until the men needed a name to sign the ledger. Then it became invisible. "Can you?" he repeated, still calm. "Yes," she said. The word came out before fear could stop it. The villagers stared. Elder Halvin looked as if she had betrayed the world itself. Mara turned her head toward the harbor water and narrowed her eyes the way she always did when diving near fogged silt. Currents had language, if you knew how to read. Pressure, color, temperature, the way foam broke against stone. She had spent years reading what the others ignored. She had found lost baskets, hidden crab traps, and one time, a child's silver ring, by following the pattern of a wave, bounce no one else had noticed. Now she read the tide and found a line that didn't belong. A drag. Not a natural one. Something anchored. Something heavy. Something dragged from the south reef toward the temple side of the harbor. Her breath caught. "There's a weight beneath the wall," she said slowly. "Not rock. Not a wreck. It's moving against the tide in a fixed pattern." Halvin's face drained of color. The harbor master turned to him. "What did you put under my harbor?" He exploded at once. "Nothing. She is making this up to save herself." But the tide rolled again and sent a ribbon of black weed curling onto the steps. Mara stared at it. Attached to the weed was a little square of wood, waterlogged but not rotten, with a carved notch in the corner. A tally mark. Her tally mark. The shape she used on her counting slips when the temple clerks asked her to sort damaged pearls by source. She made it because she could not write as fast as they talked. She made it because it helped her keep track. She took one look and felt the floor of her world slip. That mark should have been on the copies she had returned to the counting room weeks ago, not on something the sea was spitting out from beneath the harbor wall. Unless someone had kept one of her slips. Unless someone had used it. Unless her hand had been attached to something she had never been allowed to see. The Sea King watched her read it and said softly, "You recognize the mark." It was not a question. Mara's mouth went dry. "It's mine." The villagers turned to her, confused now in a new way. Mara, the shamed diver, had just identified a hidden object in the harbor by a mark only she knew how to make. A mark the elders had never bothered to notice. The truth did not arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces, and each piece hurt. The counting room, The extra quotas, the missing pearls, the secret night boats, the East Cove net, the tar on the ceremonial knife, her tally mark on the hidden wood. No wonder they had wanted her gone. If she started connecting the patterns, she might remember what she had already seen. Or worse, she might make others see it too. Elder Halvin lunged for the pier stairs. "Take her back! Put the rope on her! Now!" Two men moved at once, but the tide surged up the steps with a savage slap and knocked them off balance. One fell flat on his back. The other hit the railing and screamed as a wave soaked the boards beneath him. The sea did not let them near Mara. It was the first time the villagers saw it clearly. The water was protecting her. Not the Sea King. Her. The realization cracked through the crowd like a dropped lantern. Mara felt it in their silence. And then, from beneath the broken dock, something else shifted. A second chain. Not the one she had cut. Another one, deeper down, dragging against wood and stone. The Sea King's head snapped toward the sound. His expression changed for the first time since she had freed him. Not fear. Recognition. Which meant there was more than one captive beneath the harbor. Mara stared at him, and for the first time since the impossible rescue, she felt the shape of the next danger. He had not told her everything. The elders had not told her anything. And the tide, which had chosen her, was still not finished. Above them, the tack's vessel horn sounded again, closer now, and a voice shouted from the channel mouth that the harbor gates had been locked from the outside. Elder Halvin went rigid. The harbor master whispered, "Locked by whom?" No one answered. Then the Sea King finally lifted his chin toward the pier, his eyes glowing brighter in the green depth, and spoke the words that made every person there understand. The sea had only just begun to confess. "Bring me to the South Reef," he said. Mara's pulse kicked hard. He was asking in front of everyone, not ordering, not claiming. Asking. And because he asked, the whole pier now knew the next choice belonged to her. She looked at the elders, at their wet robes and their sudden fear. And then she looked at the water holding her upright, like it had been waiting for her to decide what kind of person she would be, now that the world could finally not ignore her. When she answered, her voice did not shake. "Then you're going to have to let me lead," she said. Mara held the pier rail with one hand and the spray with the other, because the sea was still acting strange around her, and she did not trust herself to look weak in front of the people who had spent years calling her less than nothing. The dock shuddered under her feet, not with the panic of collapse now, but with the low, listening pulse of a thing that had decided her life mattered enough to keep standing for one more breath. Below the boards, the broken harbor groaned. Men shouted. Women pulled children backward from the edge. Elder Halvin had gone pale enough that even his wet beard looked gray. He kept glancing at the water like it had become a witness he could not bribe. And in the middle of all that fear, the Sea King remained where he was, half risen from the depths and half still bound by the current of the harbor itself, his shoulders bare, his wrists marked where the glowing chain had been. He was free, and yet the way he watched Mara made it clear that freedom was not the same thing as escape. It was only when the crowd started barking orders that he shifted his gaze from her to the wreckage around them, and Mara realized with a twist in her stomach that he had been reading the village the same way she had been reading pearl beds for half her life. Not by the loudest voices, by the hidden movement underneath. The harbor tax vessel horn sounded again from beyond the channel mouth, longer this time, hard enough to make the gulls burst into the air. A second ship had joined it, then a third. Mara heard the iron clank of their moorings and the scrape of hull against tide rock. Someone out there had come expecting the harbor to be open, orderly, obedient. Instead, they had found a village in the middle of a broken miracle. Elder Halvin grabbed the harbor master by the shoulder. "Open the gates," he hissed. "They're locked from the outside," the harbor master snapped back, wild-eyed. "I told you that already." "Then break them? With what? The tide?" The words should have sounded foolish. Instead, every head turned toward Mara. She felt the weight of it instantly. Not trust. Not yet. Something more dangerous. Expectation. The sort that could turn into blame the moment she failed. The Sea King looked at her, and she saw him choose his next words carefully, as if he knew the whole village was waiting for any excuse to call him a monster again. "If the gates were locked from outside," he said, voice quiet enough that everyone had to lean toward it, "then someone did not want witnesses to enter or leave." No one answered him, because no one in the harbor wanted to say the truth that had just settled over them. The elders had not merely been hiding something, they had been sealing it in. Mara swallowed and forced her breathing steady. The water was still lifting at her calves, even though the dock had not risen. Every time she shifted her weight, the tide shifted with her. It felt less like standing in water, and more like standing inside a decision the sea had already made. She forced herself to look at Elder Halvin. "You said the sea rejected me," she said, "but it keeps reaching for me. Why?" His jaw worked once, then twice. That was answer enough. He knew. And if he knew, the others might know too. Which meant the secret had been carried by everyone who had stood around her during the banishment, with their hands folded and their mouths shut. Her chest tightened with a hot, sick anger that was almost easier to bear than the shame she had worn before. Shame had always told her she was alone in her failures. Anger told her she had been trapped in someone else's lie. The Sea King saw the change in her face. "Do not let them steer you by rage," he said, not commanding, just warning. "Rage makes people easy to predict." The words hit her harder than she expected. He was not trying to use her fury. He was trying to keep her from being trapped by it. And that, more than his title or the glow in his eyes, or the water obeying her feet, was what made the crowd uneasy. A feared man could have ordered her forward. A cruel man could have promised protection. He did neither. He asked, "Will you go to the South Reef with me?" The question hung in the salt air like a net thrown into dark water. Every person on the pier understood that if she said yes, she would be choosing him in front of everyone. If she said no, the sea might still have chosen her, but the village would claim she had chosen disgrace. Mara knew what they wanted. They wanted her frightened, grateful, and easy to direct. She straightened her shoulders. "I will go," she said, "but I'm not following behind anyone." A murmur rose through the crowd. Halvin's lip curled, as if she had dared to speak with a mouth that had once been too poor to deserve a name. The Sea King's expression shifted, not into a smile exactly, but into something that made her heart catch anyway. He inclined his head once, a small, deliberate motion that felt more respectful than any bow she had ever seen from the village elders. "Then lead," he said. It should have sounded impossible. A rejected diver leading a sea king through a harbor full of witnesses and lies. Instead, it felt like the first honest sentence the harbor had spoken in years. Mara took the first step off the broken pier, and the tide rose to meet her shin like a path being laid down. The villagers recoiled, but the water did not. It parted around her legs and gathered again behind her, patient as a held breath. She turned toward the east channel where the reef line broke the surface in black teeth. The south reef lay beyond it, a low, jagged spine under the water, where currents snarled and fishermen avoided. As a child, she had learned to read that place from the boat deck, where bubbles pinned themselves to the slick water, where schools of fish flashed too suddenly, where the seabed changed from sand to stone. Her father had once said, the reef could be crossed only by people who paid attention to what the sea tried not to hide. She had not thought of him in years without pain. Now she thought of him because the memory came attached to another one, sharper and more dangerous. There had been a night, months before her banishment, when she had counted salvage pearl sacks in the storage room and noticed the numbers did not match the net weight from the harvest boats. She had said so. Quietly, carefully. The elder scribe had smiled at her and told her to keep her eyes on the shells, not on the ledgers. Then he had sent her home before dark with a salt cake and a warning not to worry herself with matters above her station. At the time, she had believed him. Now she remembered another detail, a stain. Dark tar on the corner of a ledger crate that should never have left the counting room. The same tar that had been on the ceremonial knife. The same tar she had smelled last night on the rope coil near the harbor gate. Her steps slowed, not because she was afraid, because she was remembering. The sea beside her trembled, and the Sea King spoke without looking away from the channel. "You have seen this before." It was not a question. Mara glanced at him. "I have counted the harbor's goods for 6 seasons. I have seen every false number they thought I would miss." His gaze cut toward her with sudden intensity. "And did you miss them?" She remembered the ledger marks, the shaved figures, the altered weights, the way elders had argued over temple dues whenever pearl season ran short, as if the sea itself had grown stingy. She remembered every time she had opened her mouth and been told she was overstepping. "No," she said. The answer seemed to land between them like a dropped blade. He nodded once, as if something in him had just confirmed itself. "Then your eyes are not the reason the sea chose you," he said. "Your refusal to lie is." Mara stared at him. The sentence should have comforted her. Instead, it frightened her, because if it was true, then the sea had not chosen her by accident. It had chosen the one person in the harbor who still looked for what was missing. Behind them, a shout rose from the pier. "She's going to the reef! Stop her! Who gave her permission? Is he leading her? No, she's leading him." That last cry cracked through the crowd like a struck shell. Mara kept walking. The South Reef route passed beneath the lower winch house and along a half-collapsed stone causeway. The tide slapped the pilings in hard, irregular beats, and each beat left a bright sheen on the wood that made the whole harbor seem newly washed, newly exposed. Men rushed toward the causeway, then stopped when the water surged ankle-high around Mara's path. It did not flood the village. It simply moved to make room for her and nowhere else. The wrongness of that made more people afraid than the dock sinking had. The Sea King kept pace at her left, not crowding, not touching. Every now and then he glanced toward the crowd, as if measuring how much honesty they could survive at once. When a boy of about 20 tried to step into the path with a spear and a trembling hand, the tide slapped the spear shaft sideways and knocked it from his grip. The boy stumbled back, staring at Mara as if she had personally turned the sea into a guard dog. She hated that expression almost as much as the old one. Fear was still a cage, even when it looked like reverence. At the base of the causeway, the harbor master caught up, breathless. "Mara," he said, using her name for the first time in public in years, and the sound of it made her flinch more than any insult would have. "If you go to that reef now, with him, and the tax officials see." "See what?" she said. "That I can walk where you all said I was unworthy?" His face tightened. "You don't understand what's happening." "Then explain it." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The Sea King's voice was low. "He cannot," he said. "Not if he wishes to keep breathing." The harbor master went white. So did 2 men behind him. Mara looked at them sharply. Fear of the elders was one thing. Fear of death was another. That level of panic meant the lie was not just shameful. It was punished. "What are you not saying?" she demanded. No answer. The silence itself became a confession. She turned back to the water, furious now, but careful not to let the fury drive her. The Sea King had warned her. Rage made people easy to predict. So she did the harder thing. She went still. When she stood still, the tide around her settled too. The villagers noticed. Every face on the causeway shifted with the realization that her stillness had power. Not the wild power of a storm. Something older, a listening power. The Sea King noticed it too. He watched her like a man watching a door open in a room he had been trapped inside for years. "There," he murmured. "That is the form of it." "Of what?" she whispered back. But he did not answer directly. He only said, "The sea responds to what you do when no one is applauding." The word struck something deep in her chest, a memory of night dives and cold fingers and the small, dangerous mercy she had never told anyone about. There had been a place below the oyster beds where juvenile sea drakes nested in the rock. Local law said no one was allowed near them because the creatures bit, and because the village used their shells for charms during marriage season. Mara had found one tangled in discarded line last winter, just before the ban, its wing membrane cut and bleeding. She had cut the line free and hidden it in a crack until dark, returning every night for 6 nights with crushed fish and a cloth wrap to keep the wound clean. It had not thanked her. It had only watched her with one bright eye until it could swim again. She had never told anyone because kindness was the sort of thing people in her village treated like evidence of weakness. Now the Sea King spoke again, and she realized with a jolt that he knew she was remembering something she had not said. "You thought no one saw that," he said. Mara stopped so abruptly the tide curled around her toes. The causeway, the crowd, the tax boats beyond the gates, they all faded under the force of his words. "What did you say?" she asked, though she already knew. He did not soften. He did not smile. He simply looked at her with a terrible steadiness that made her feel more exposed than nakedness ever had. "I saw you," he said. "Not that night. Before. After. Every time you carried something broken away from the net and pretended it was only cargo." Her mouth went dry. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever named her hidden work without twisting it into theft or foolishness or disobedience. The villagers were staring now, not at the Sea King, but at her, because they had heard enough to know the impossible thing was happening again. A feared power was not just tolerating her, it was recognizing her. Elder Halvin found his voice at last, and it came out rough with panic. "Do not listen to him. He is a tide-spawn liar. He will use you to pry open the reefs and sink us all." The Sea King did not even turn his head. "If I wanted to sink you," he said calmly, "you would already be drowning in the lies you chose." That set the crowd off again. Voices rose. Someone cried that he was cursing them. Someone else shouted for the temple guards. A woman grabbed her son and pulled him close, but her eyes were on Mara with the desperate hunger of someone who wanted to believe the sea could choose someone honest. Mara should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt the terrible weight of being needed. Because need was dangerous. Need could turn into sacrifice. Need could turn into blame. Need could make a person a target. And yet, standing there with the tide still obedient around her ankles, she understood she was no longer a girl waiting for permission to matter. She was already in the middle of a story large enough to drown the village if she took the wrong step. A ripple cut through the water beside the causeway, then another. Mara saw it before anyone else because she was watching the current as she had been taught. A line of bubbles, too straight to be natural, slid under the surface from the direction of the outer channel. Not a fish trail, not a wave, a dragged object. Her pulse jumped. The Sea King saw it too. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time since she had freed him, something like anger flickered across his face. "Do not touch it," he said. She looked at him sharply. "Why?" "Because it is not meant for you." Which was not the same as saying it was not meant to be seen. The bubbles widened. A long, dark shape rolled just beneath the surface near the reef line, dragged by something tied below it. The water over it looked oily, as if tar had been poured into the current. Mara's breath caught. She knew that stain. Tar on a ledger crate. Tar on the ceremonial knife. Tar on the rope coil near the harbor gate. And now, tar in the water. The same tar, showing up wherever the elders' hands had tried to hide a record. The shape bumped against a reef stone and turned half over in the swell. A sealed chest. Not a pearl chest, a counting chest. And tied to it, under the black rope, was a second harbor seal. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. The old harbor master seal had already surfaced from the tide. This one had not washed in by accident. It had been dragged here. By whoever had locked the harbor gates. The Sea King's jaw tightened. "Now you see," he said. Mara stared at the chest rolling in the shallow surf and felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. The elders had not only been hiding the village's pearl records, they had been throwing them to the reef, and whatever was inside that chest was about to tell her why the sea had chosen the rejected diver instead of the men who had spent years teaching the village how to obey. She moved one step forward and the tide rose with her. Then, from the outer channel, a voice shouted her name. Not Halvin's, not the harbor master's. A stranger's voice, hard with authority. Mara of the East Coves, it called. By order of the Coastal Tax Office, step away from the reef and surrender the Sea King at once. Every head snapped toward the sound. 3 tax vessels were already turning into the harbor mouth, and on the front deck of the nearest one stood a woman in brass-edged rain armor with a seal ledger in one hand and a hooked chain in the other, looking directly at Mara like she had come to collect something stolen. The Sea King went still beside her, not afraid, but dangerously alert. And Mara, standing with the tide at her knees and the truth surfacing at her feet, realized the next lie was not going to come from the village at all. It was coming from the people who had arrived to make the village disappear. The tax woman's vessel cut into the harbor like it owned the water, but the water did not move for her the way it did for Mara. It parted, yes, only because the tide had decided to make a path to the truth. Mara stood at the reef with the sealed counting chest rocking at her feet and the Sea King beside her, one hand braced against the stone, the other still bound by the thin remnant of the glowing chain that had once pinned him under the dock. The brass-armored stranger on the nearest vessel lifted her ledger and shouted again, louder this time, as if volume could force the ocean to obey. By authority of the Coast Office, that chest and that creature are to be surrendered. You are interfering with Crown Collection. Around the harbor, the villagers were no longer cheering for the elders. They were not cheering for Mara either. They were standing in the ugly pause between fear and understanding, which was the most dangerous place of all. Halvin had already backed away from the edge of the dock, his face pale with the first real thought he had ever had in his life. The older men beside him were arguing in furious whispers, but their words were too small to cover what was happening. The tide was climbing the pilings. The air had turned metallic. Even the gulls had gone silent. The Sea King glanced at Mara, not to command, not to rescue, but to ask, "What will you do?" That question steadied her more than any praise could have. Mara crouched beside the counting chest and ran her thumb over the black tar sealing its seam. Her old work came back to her hands at once, not magic, memory. She knew how the elders had closed things they meant to hide. They never trusted one lock. They used 3. Tar to keep a seam from being pried open. Rope to make a second seal. And always, always, a false mark at the knot to tell them whether anyone had tampered with the record. She found the mark immediately. A crooked slash pressed into the rope beneath the tar. The same mark she had once seen on the tax sacks when she was young enough to believe the Count was honest. Her stomach turned. "They were paying you," she said, looking up at the brass-armored woman. "Not all of it, but enough to keep you from asking why the village kept sending pearls that were never recorded." The woman's expression did not change, and that told Mara everything. Not surprise. Recognition. The Sea King's voice came low beside her. "She knows." Mara nodded. Then she placed her palm against the chest. The tide climbed higher. Not around her. Through the seams. A wet groan worked through the wood, and the tar split like old scabbed skin. The lid shuddered. The rope knot unwound by itself, one coil at a time, as if invisible fingers were loosening it in answer to Mara's touch. The villagers drew back in fear when the chest gave one heavy cough and spat water over the stones. Inside were not pearls. There were ledgers, stacks of them. Thin books, water stiffened at the edges, each one tied with colored thread to mark a season. Mara pulled the top one free and opened it with shaking hands. The names inside were familiar. Fishermen, widows, orphans. The families that had been told they owed more than they could ever pay. Beside each name was a pearl tally, a grain count, and then a second figure written in a different hand. The second figure was always larger. The difference, page after page, had not gone to the crown. It had gone to the elders. A murmur moved through the shore crowd like a wave breaking under ice. Mara kept reading because she could not stop. The numbers were bad enough. The notes in the margins were worse. Reassign blame. Quiet this widow. Cut diver's share. Increase penalty if Mara speaks again. And on the final page, in a hand, she knew as well as her own heartbeat, was the order that had ruined her life. Seal witness Mara from reef counts. Refuse her shore license. If she will not bend, banish her at the next full tide. It was signed by the 3 elders, and beneath their names, in a smaller line, was the coastal tax seal. Mara looked up slowly. The woman in brass had gone still. The Sea King moved first, not toward the woman, toward the villagers. He stepped to the edge of the dock where everyone could see him, water running from his shoulders in silver lines. The weight of his presence changed the air. He did not roar. He did not threaten. He simply stood there, impossible and alive, and waited for the harbor to decide whether it would look at him or keep pretending it had never been afraid. When he spoke, his voice carried over every roof. The sea did not choose a liar, he said. It chose the one who kept count when no one thanked her for it. Mara's throat tightened painfully. That was the first time he had spoken of her before the village, as though her work mattered more than her shame. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. And she freed me without asking what she would get for it. There it was again. Not ownership, not claiming. A truth spoken plainly enough to protect her from being reduced to a rumor. The brass-armored woman recovered first. You're making a public interference, she snapped. The Crown will not accept tide corruption as legal defense. Mara looked down at the open ledger in her hands. Then she looked at the woman's hooked chain. It was not a weapon. It was an anchor tool, the kind used to hold a vessel steady over deep water when the current wanted to drag it off course. Mara knew that tool. Every diver in the East Coves knew it. She stood and walked to the dock edge with the ledger held high. Then let the Crown see what was anchored under this harbor, she said. Because you are not here to collect taxes. You are here to keep the reef from surfacing. The tax woman's face changed for the first time. Not guilt. Fear. That was when Mara understood the final lie. The village elders had not been hiding a theft alone. They'd been hiding what the theft was covering. She flipped the ledger to the final insert, the page written on oilskin to survive floodwater, and showed the line marked in red tide ink. Beneath the village, beneath the South Reef, beneath the place where the pearl beds should have been healthiest, there was a buried anchor, a crown anchor. Old enough to predate the current elders, heavy enough to pin the harbor's deepest current in place, and connected to it, by chain after chain, were the quotas, the punishments, the false shortages, The tax errors, the whole weight of the village's obedience. The harbor had been managed like a net, not to protect the people, to keep them feeding the same small group forever. The Sea King's gaze went to the reef channel at once. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, his anger was no longer only about his own chains. The sea itself was holding back, waiting for him to ask. Mara understood then why she had been chosen. Not because she was noble, because she noticed what others ignored, because she counted, because she kept the small truth when it would have been easier to accept the large lie, because she had been the one person in the harbor whose hands knew how to separate treasure from theft. The tide rose another foot. The brass-armored woman lifted her hook chain. "If you take that anchor loose," she said, low now, "you'll flood half the district." Mara smiled without humor. "So that's why you never asked who was drowning for the other half." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the villagers at the back shouted, "My brother vanished in the lower tunnels 3 winters ago." Another voice followed. "My mother's claim was doubled. My name was erased from the winter count. It was them. It was always them." The shore broke open with accusation, not yet courage, but close enough. Mara's chest hurt. The shame that had eaten at her for so long was still there, but it no longer had a clean shape. It had mixed with something fiercer. Proof. She looked at the Sea King. He did not move to act until she nodded. That mattered more than anything else in the harbor. "Yes," she said, voice rough. "We pull it." The Sea King lifted his hand, and the tide answered in a deep rolling surge. Not a command to destroy, a request to reveal. The water rose around the dock supports and slid beneath the reef stones, finding the buried chain by instinct. Mara, because she was who she was, because she had spent her life reading the harbor by currents and bruised stones, and the way silt settled after a lie, pointed toward the South Channel and shouted where to cut first. The villagers nearest the boats hesitated, then moved. Not because they trusted the Sea King, because they trusted the sight of Mara standing upright, while the water held her clear of the flood, because they had seen her when the elders tried to break her, because the sea had made a throne of the place meant to kill her. Men with knives and women with axes rushed the mooring lines. Someone threw a rope to Mara, then another. The tax woman barked an order, but her own crew was already looking at the open ledger pages, reading their names in the crooked margins, realizing too late what kind of ship they had boarded. The first chain came up with a scream of rust and old pressure. Then the second. And as the crown anchor loosened from the reef, the whole harbor shuddered. The water that had been held back for years poured through the channel in a widening silver flood. Not a destruction, a release. The false calm of the village tore apart, and with it came the hidden things. A buried counting stone with elder marks. Pearl sacks meant for the widows, stamped and never delivered. The bones of the lower tunnels, where those who had asked too many questions were sent to work until they disappeared into the wet dark. The villagers stared as proof after proof surfaced, and with each revelation, the elders' authority shrank to the size of the fraud it had always been. At last, the brass-armored woman stepped back from the dock, her hooked chain lowering without her permission. She had come to collect a creature. Instead, she had been made to witness a system. Mara picked up the final loose page from the ledger, the one that had floated free when the chest split open, and saw the signature at the bottom. Not one elder. All of them. And under the sign-off, in the smallest hand, one phrase repeated like a confession too cowardly to say aloud. "Let the sea take the blame." Mara exhaled shakily. For years, she had thought the village despised her because she was clumsy, poor, stubborn, too soft, too much of a diver, and not enough of a daughter for the men who ran the shore. But the truth was worse and better at once. They had not merely rejected her, they had feared that she could see. The Sea King came to stand before her, close enough now that the villagers could not pretend not to see how he looked at her. Not like a prize, not like a savior, like someone who had found the one person in the harbor who could speak the language he had been trapped beneath. "The tide obeyed you because you never lied to it," he said quietly. Mara's eyes burned. "That is not enough to save anyone." "No," he answered, "but it is enough to begin." He lifted the broken remnant of the chain from his wrist and set it in her palm. It was warm, not with magic, with memory, the kind of heat that stays in a hand after someone has chosen you in front of the world. The harbor bells began to ring at last, not for an execution, not for a banishment, but for a reckoning no one had rehearsed. By dusk, the elders would be gone from the cliff house. By nightfall, the tax vessels would be held in the outer channel by the same tide that had once made Mara impossible to kill. By morning, the village would have to decide whether it wanted to be ruled by the account books of thieves or by the woman they had shamed into the sea. Mara looked from the flooding reef to the faces on the dock, to the man who had once called her worthless and now could not meet her eyes, to the feared king standing beside her like a storm that had finally learned restraint. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt strangely calm, because the ocean had answered, not by making her into something else, by proving that what they called weakness had always been the thing that let her hear the truth. And if you had watched her then, standing in the water while the harbor surrendered its lies, you would have understood the whole story in one breath. The rejected diver was never chosen by accident. She was chosen because she could see what power tried to bury. And the tide, which had never belonged to the elders, had at last found the one person who would not waste it. If this story pulled you in, stay with it, because the sea does not finish with one miracle. It always reveals one more secret when someone finally tells the truth out loud.